objectively speaking, I had no faith whatsoever that Penn State would be in the Big Ten title game because, as you know, and everybody else knew, that Ohio State was projected to steamroll Michigan. But turns out Penn State's in the Big Ten title game, and now Dan Lanning's got to prepare for Penn State when he even said in his press game conference going into this game that he was preparing for Ohio State, and he essentially said, "Hey, I know Andy Kolenicki. He's a creative play caller. He has an extensive history of being creative, scoring a lot of points, and that's what he's done for Penn State this year. Especially when you think about Penn State in the sense of there's really no dominant wide receiver on this team, and you also have had recurring injuries with Nick Singleton too. So now that you anticipate having him be 100% healthy for this game seems a lot more intriguing to me. And even with Oregon too, Oregon's 12-0. They steamrolled Washington last week. They had a couple scares against Boise State, Ohio State, and Wisconsin. But overall, when you look at this Oregon team, they are clearly the number one team in the country. They, at this point, probably still should be favored to win the national championship. Although I've been on record on this show saying I think Georgia was my preseason prediction, and I still think they can do it now. But in terms of the Big Ten title picture, there's a lot of obvious reasons why Oregon would win this game. There really are no obvious weaknesses on this team, and they're 12-0. They've taken care of business when they've had to. Big Ten championship game in Lucas Oil Stadium. Which should favor Penn State. But when you look at this game, like I said a couple seconds ago, there are so many obvious reasons why Oregon would win this game. But in my opinion, if you want to make this more interesting, to me, there should be more. This video should really be about why Penn State has a chance of winning this game, and they do. Everybody talks about. I've talked about this on the program. I've talked shit about James Franklin enough times. I live in Philadelphia, so I hear it every single time that they have a big game that James Franklin simply can't get the job done. But you have two powerhouse programs for the first time since 2015 that both these programs are in the top 5 for the Big Ten championship game. So at least in my opinion on paper, this is at least for me one of the most exciting Big Ten championship games that I can recently remember. And also, if I'm being somewhat biased, then it definitely helps having Penn State in it too. But in terms of this video, to me, there are 3 reasons why Penn State does have a chance at beating Oregon, even though, objectively speaking, they certainly are the underdog. Now, if you're looking at Penn State, if you ask themselves, what do they have to do to win this game? To me, the first thing they absolutely need to do is the creativity has to be on display this week. Out of all the times that you cannot have a dud, it is this week. Because even when you look back at the Ohio State game, the 2 biggest weaknesses that we saw was that the wide receivers did not get any sort of separation whatsoever, and Ohio State stuffed Penn State's rushing attack. And granted, I'll concede that Penn State does not have that dominant presence that they really need in order to take it to the next level. But when you have Drew Allar and when you have Nick Singleton, who's now 100% healthy going into this game, it definitely adds a couple different options for you too. And especially for those of you who watch Penn State versus Maryland, the one thing that I was really excited about as I was watching Nick Singleton this weekend was the amount that they used him in the receiving game too. Because if you're going to beat this Oregon team, you have to be creative and you have to be willing to spread them out. So if I'm Andy Kolenicki, one of the things I'm saying to myself is, how do I utilize Nick Singleton in a sense that gets him going early, that gets his confidence going? Because in many ways, the Maryland game was really a tune-up game, right? I mean, he had 13 carries, 80-something yards, a handful of receptions. So it was exactly what you needed it to be for him. But in order to win a game like this, you have to be creative and you have to take chances. And what I mean by chances is I don't want to see any conservative play calling. I want to see some aggressiveness, particularly in the red zone and on 4th down, which they failed to execute versus Ohio State. So that's another thing that's going to have to change if they have any sort of chance of winning this game. But the creativity has been on display this season. You can even think about the Minnesota game, for example, where not necessarily on offense, but they did go for that fake punt and ultimately got it too. So it's little things like that that to me are going to be the difference between talking about Penn State as number 1 seed versus them ultimately being a sort of outlier, just another filler team for the playoff too. And when you look at Penn State too, again, a lot of this matchup is really going to pertain to the offensive battle, and we know what Oregon's going to do. They're going to be aggressive. They're going to get Dillon Gabriel going early, particularly with the long ball. So if you're Penn State, how do you counteract that? You counteract that by Oregon being on the field as long as possible, winning that time of possession, and keeping them honest and balanced. Because the one thing you have to ask yourself too, and going into the second segment, or the second reason why Penn State has a chance to win this game is Tyler Warren. He is easily the best weapon that they have on the offensive side of the ball. He has 10 touchdowns this year, 1,167 all-purpose yards. And right now, and Dan Lanning said this in his pregame conference too, in many ways, what makes Tyler Warren so special is the matchup nightmare that it presents for Oregon. Because yes, you can cover an elite receiver. You can get a corner to play a slot receiver tight and not let him get deep in the middle of the field. But when you have a tight end who has the speed of a running back, who has athleticism of a wide receiver, and can also be utilized in the rushing game, it definitely creates a lot of issues for a defense too. And you saw Tyler Warren being used a lot in terms of the USC game, in terms of Minnesota and Illinois. So even though he's been used in consistently a lot of these big matchups too, and even though, yes, they've had wins against Bowling Green and UCLA and West Virginia and all that too, he shines the most in these moments where his number is going to get called upon. On those 3rd and 1s, those 4th and 1s, Tyler Warren can be the guy that they go to, where if I'm Drew Allar and I'm sitting back and I have Tyler Warren to my left and Nick Singleton to my right, Oregon is going to second guess who they're going to give it to. Because even Drew Allar, I'm not saying he's the greatest rushing quarterback. I'm not necessarily going to call him a dual threat like I would Dillon Gabriel, for example. However, he is a pocket quarterback, and he is athletic enough to beat you on the run here and there. So in terms of this offense, another thing I ask myself too is how are they going to utilize Tyler Warren in a way that once again spreads out Oregon in a way where they have to respect Singleton, and maybe it gives an opportunity for some of these receivers that we don't talk about as much to be able to make a big play in a big time moment. Because out of all the things I'm most worried about in terms of this Penn State Oregon game, it's what happens when Penn State has the same exact start like they've pretty much had all year. Because I've been on record saying this throughout the season. One of my biggest complaints about Penn State this year is the fact that they cannot get off to a quick start. No matter what happens, no matter what game it seems to be, they can somehow only turn on the lights in the second half. And when you're playing teams like Oregon, and when you're going into a playoff battle, you just cannot afford to be having slow starts like this. Which leads me to my next thought, which I presented in my ticker there, is that Oregon has scored 31 points in 10 out of their last 11 games. And if Oregon gets a little bit overly aggressive on the defense side of the ball, and Penn State's creative enough to be able to exploit that, I would not be surprised at all if this ended up being a shootout game. Because with Penn State, you're trying to find the balance between being creative and taking chances, but also winning that time of possession and putting your defense in the best position to succeed. Which leads me to my third and final point in terms of why Penn State can win this game. It's going to be the pass rush. To me, if Penn State has any chance at upsetting Oregon and making that statement win that James Franklin needs to solidify his legacy here, you need the pass rush to get home, plain and simple. Now, for the most part, Oregon has done a solid job at protecting Dillon Gabriel this year. Dillon Gabriel is a special talent, statistically speaking, one of the greatest quarterbacks of college football. And in terms of starts, before the season he had 49 starts. So that puts him at least 60 now. He has great touch, brilliant football IQ, knows how to exploit coverages and schemes, and knows where to go with the football. His pocket presence and awareness is brilliant. He knows when to sense danger and when to find those guys down the field. However, if you were to sit there and give Dillon Gabriel a weakness, perhaps it's that some of his mechanics and some of the scrambling tends to go away when it's under pressure. Because if you're Dillon Gabriel and you're this Penn State defense, if you're Tom Allen sitting there saying to yourself, how do I attack Dillon Gabriel? He's not necessarily an elite scrambler, but he is a dual threat quarterback. He's quick enough to the point where maybe on a 3rd and 5, if those linebackers get caught sleeping on a quarterback spy, yeah, he might be able to run a little bit and get a first down here and there. However, he's not the dual threat kind of like Lenora Sellers, for example, where you have to worry about him going on an option every single play. So it's finding that happy medium too, because Penn State, one of the reasons I love watching Penn State, besides just because I'm from the area, but it's the fact of just how explosive Abdul Carter and these edge rushers that they have really are. Because you can go back and watch the Maryland game, you can go back and watch the USC game, you can go back and watch Illinois, whatever game you want to pick. The one thing that is consistent with Penn State is that the defense has been spectacular this season. Even against Ohio State, they only gave up a handful of points, and for the most part, when they needed to stop, they were able to get them. However, the offense really wasn't clicking in that sense too. And Penn State ranks 6th in the FBS in terms of team defense, 14 points per game, which is a phenomenal stat in college football. But overall, when you look at this Oregon team, they just have so many explosive players and so many different ways to beat you. And that was on full display last week against Washington, whether it's them rushing for 6 yards per game or having 222 yards of rushing or having 400 plus yards of passing or 400 plus yards of offense. It really speaks to the amount of talent that Oregon has. It speaks to Dan Lanning as being an excellent coach, well-disciplined team, an excellent motivator, and he deserves all the credit and recognition in the world. But look for this game to be a shootout, and look for Penn State to be aggressive early, particularly on the pass rush. Look for them to be creative and watch them find a lot of different ways to utilize Nick Singleton and Tyler Warren, because these two are ultimately going to be the X factors in this game in terms of Penn State pulling off the upset and winning the Big Ten title, or a predictable Oregon victory where they march into the college football playoff being undefeated.